Welcome to the Painting Insights podcast. We have been working on something in the background.
That's right. We've actually started a Patreon channel. For the last couple of months, we've had previous guests revisit the channel to give us additional content, everything from studio tours, sketchbook tours, talking us through the process of paintings and all kinds of additional treats, which you're exclusively going to see as a patron who supports the channel.
So by supporting us on Patreon, you help the channel keep going. There's a lot of work put into this, from the video editing to the sourcing of guests. So you really help us find those guests and to put the content out.
And we have lots of content planned for the near future. So the links for that will be in the description of this video and in the description on the podcast channels. And otherwise, you can go on to Patreon and type in Painting Insights Podcast and support us that way. Thanks very much. Enjoy the video. Okay, would you mind introducing yourself for the audience, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Devin Cecil-Wishing. I am originally from San Francisco, although I've been living in New York for the past 15 years now. I'm a painter. I work in oil paints primarily, and for the most part, am kind of engaged in, trying to work with kind of some of the traditional ways that this medium was kind of developed and existed for, several hundred years. So in my practice, everything, that I'm painting is basically either from life or imagination or memory. So there's not, I'm not, for example, painting from photography or, from like using AI or anything sort of like that. For the most part, right, it is my own kind of attempt to get in touch with sort of the earlier modes of, I think, how this medium was really, really practiced in a lot of ways.
Is there a point where you did use photo reference and found that it had limitations, or have you never revisited to that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So when I was younger, later on, I sort of found the atelier world and, studied at the Grand Central Atelier where I teach now. But prior to that, I went to a kind of regular art college back in California, the California College of the Arts, and was an illustration major. And so in, studying illustration and then working kind of briefly as an illustrator after school, it was all very heavily, kind of photo referencey, right? And I say, when I finished college and, finished studying illustration, I did work, as an illustrator for a little bit, not super long, actually. It was pretty quick in doing that I kind of decided it wasn't really the thing that I wanted to be doing, and making paintings was really the thing that I was had originally been interested in. And right around that time, I found an atelier very much by accident, actually, in Oakland. And it was called the Atelier School of Classical Realism. It was run by a guy named David Hardy. It's a really great guy. And that was sort of my introduction to like this atelier world thing, which I had never heard of, prior to that. And I remember I would show him, kind of some of the things I'd be doing, and he would kind of scoff at it a little bit and say like, well, the camera did a lot of the work for you. And I would sort of be like, what do you mean by that? And because to me it was, and I think so many people fall into this category at first, that I think in this point, historically, we almost sort of, if you're any kind of a representational artist, it's almost taken for granted that you're using photos. It's like, well, what else would you be doing almost, right? And that was very much where my head was at the time. And And I was kind of like, okay, that's interesting. He's sort of got this, anti-photo thing going on a little bit, right? But we got. I liked him a lot. We got along well. I studied with him for a few years before eventually moving to New York to study at the Grand Central Atelier. But it kind of took me a while to really like fully grasp, the differences between those things. And for quite some time, I was kind of like, well, I don't know. I'm not sure if it really makes that much of a difference, whether you're working from life or a photo, and it really was kind of a gradual, almost sort of awakening in a way to sort of the reality of really the differences between them, right? And I think that in a lot of regards, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you could kind of come at the difference, but I think one that I think gets maybe used more frequently is you'll hear people talk about the distortions that a camera gives you, right? That like the colors aren't really what you see in life, that the values aren't really what you see in life, that the shapes aren't even actually really what you see in life, right? And all of that is really true, right? But there's actually, to my mind, I think kind of even maybe deeper reasons that I find it, compelling to work from life, which is that the decision making that you make actually becomes different by necessity, right? And when you look at, say, one of those old like Dutch floral painters that have like 20 million different blooming flowers in the same sort of composition together, right? Well, obviously they weren't doing it from a photograph, right? And you're like, well, wait a second, right? How did they do that, right? How did they make this super, super finished looking thing of a subject that is gone in, a day, right? That moves even throughout the one day, right? Or you look at some, seascape, right? That, you'll see them paint these just amazing ocean waves and stuff, 200 years before the invention of photography. And you're just like, well, they did it somehow, right? Like, how did they do that, right? And I think the understanding, right, and the thought process and the decisiveness, right, that you have to cultivate in order to make that work, to me, is so much of the interesting part of painting, right? And lots of times another example that I'll use is that you can look at a Rubens or like a Franz Snyder's or a Paul DeVos painting, right, of all these animals, and you'll see these like half dozen dogs like fighting with a bear, right? And you're just like, how the heck did he do that, right? And it's like, well, how did he do that, right? Well, like he understood the anatomy of those animals really well, right? They probably watched them, at some way or another in action to see, how they move, how they do these things. They had this great understanding of drawing and how light works against form to make it all, sort of come together and be believable. And I think in so many ways, when we kind of get the camera out and go like, oh man, that's like really hard though. Like, what if I just take a photo and then like paint from that, right? It'll like hold this thing still for me. And then I can kind of copy from that. To me, it's sort of like, well, sorta, right? But like, also it sort of takes like, to me, all the enjoyment, all the discovery, all of the, interest kind of out of that process, right? It sort of sterilizes it in this weird way by sort of sidestepping having to make all those decisions, having to get down to the bottom of all these things, having to get in and sort of contend with like, okay, what do I know and what do I not really know well enough to really pull this off,
It's interesting because I've experienced when I was invited once to draw arches, and I never done that before, and my brain just was so overloaded with
arches, like the architectural arches, you mean?
No, sorry, yeah, archers. Sorry, archers.
Oh, archers. Yeah. I got you. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, it's my accent because I'm northern.
No, my fault.
Archers, and and my brain was just overloaded with form that I hadn't contemplated before, that it sort of scrambled it, and I was experienced a moment of paralysis where I just couldn't make the first mark because I couldn't read what I was looking at, and it took a while to make the first decision and then to build from that first decision. So I suppose it's a similar phenomenon where if you're seeing something in life that's moving and you're trying to understand the form, the texture, and trying to make good decisions quick because
Yep.
it changes. That's a unique challenge from, or a separate challenge from the contemplations or considerations of copying a photograph or using a photograph to then create something more imaginative from that reference. So how long did it take you to make the full adjustment? How long have you been doing that to completely discard photo reference?
Oh, it's been a pretty long time. I mean, gosh, probably, well, more than 15 years for sure. Somewhere in between probably 15 and 20 years, really. Um, and yeah, it's been a while at this
Yeah.
point, I guess.
Does it change the considerations of what it is that you will paint? Do you kind of then think, if it were a photograph, I could set these things up, or I could manufacture this or Photoshop it? When I'm doing it from life, because I'm going to ask you about imagination after this, but if you're doing it from life, what considerations do you make in order to harness the kind of the finite amount of time that you have with those objects? Just as you said with the flowers, they change daily. So how do you manage that?
Yeah, it depends. To a degree. For the most part, if you are working with something really, highly perishable or, something like that, you just have to move quickly, right? And so, I've been doing a series of paintings right now of painting a lot of fish at the moment, and very finite amount of time that you get to work with those, right? And so, if I, for example, go down to the fish market and buy a fish to paint, I basically kind of give myself a rule that I've got one day, right, to paint that fish in my studio, and no, I paint from home. My partner and I are both painters. We turned our living room into our studio, and so after a day of having a fish sitting out, you don't necessarily want to keep working with that a whole lot longer than that, especially in your living space. And so, pretty much I say, okay, well, each one that I have, I'm going to give myself, one day, and whatever I'm going to do with this, I'm going to do in that one day, right? And so if I've got a more, complex sort of composition that I'm building, it's about kind of breaking it into chunks, right? So I'm essentially saying, okay, I'm going to do this part of it today. I'm going to set this up. I'm going to get that in. Then I'm going to, get rid of this fish at the end of the day. I'm going to get a different one, right? Not to keep working on the same fish in the painting, but like a totally different one to put, somewhere else in the painting. Okay, I've got one day to do this, right? And then it's gone, right? So you have to kind of pace yourself a little bit, right? And there's different things. Different approaches to that. You can also do a study and then kind of work from your studies, right? So if I need little fillers for certain bits of a painting, a little, few leaves coming up in the corner or something, I have kind of, almost like stock sketches you could think of, right? That, I've just gone out and made little drawings or made little oil sketches of different little plants and rocks and things like that, if I need something to fill a spot like that in a painting, I can kind of look through some of my studies and say like, oh, okay, I've got a pretty good rock here that I can put that rock here, right? And which it's a way a lot of painters really used to work quite a lot, right? And, I always use this example that back when I lived in California, I saw this really amazing show. It was at the Getty Museum, and it was paintings that were collaborations between Rubens and Jan Bruegel. And essentially, for the most part, what they would do was that Rubens would paint the people and Bruegel would paint the animals and the scenery and these other things, right? And they had all these really great, great paintings that, they would paint like the Garden of Eden, and it'd be Adam and Eve, and there'd be all these animals all over the place. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating about them was that when they were made, right, I mean, at that time, they were all going to different places, right? It's not like Rubens and Bruegel were like having a show where they were exhibiting all these things, right? It was like, well, one was for this church, one was for, this rich guy over here, right? They were all being made in a studio and then going different places. But when you see them all together, you start to notice some of the, motifs repeating, right? And I remember when I saw the show, my girlfriend at the time and we had a pet guinea pig, and I noticed in the front of one of the paintings there were these two little guinea pigs sort of munching on a piece of lettuce, which, I mean, a guinea pig would have been, I think, a fairly, exotic, unusual thing in, Antwerp at that time, right? And so as I, walked around the show, I was looking at another painting, and I go, hey, there's those two same guinea pigs down in the front again. And you start walking around, I was like, hey, there they are again. Hey, there they are again. Hey, oh, hey, there's that same leopard in this painting and that painting, right? And no, definitely, I mean, he would have had some, collection of sketches and drawings and, things that he had made of different animals. It's not like he had a jaguar coming by his studio every time he needed one, right? But you would see, he'd kind of say, okay, I'll put this kind of here, put this kind of here. You'll see sort of the same thing. If you look at a lot of Franz Snyder's was another painter I like a lot, right? That, does these great, fish market scenes and stuff like that. And you'll kind of see, if you look at a handful of them, they're not all repetitions, but there are certain things that pop up, particularly if it's what I suspect, at least my theory is that particularly things that were maybe a little more exotic or difficult to get, that he couldn't just go out and get whenever he wanted, right? So you'll see some weird fish, in one painting, and then you'll kind of see the same one tucked away, somewhere else in another painting, So, I mean, that can be one way of approaching it. But then also, I think the more, sketches and studies and things that you do from life, also the more able you are to kind of make stuff up a little bit, right? And particularly if you've got kind of a comfortable grasp of how light and volumes interact, right? That if you really understand that idea of light and form, right, it makes it a lot easier to kind of invent stuff. So lots of times if I need, some rock or, a little plant or something, lots of times I'll say like, okay, well, I've kind of, painted some of this kind of rock before. I can sort of like just make one up over here a little bit, right? And that depends on what role it's playing in the painting, right? I mean, if it was really, front and center and the star of the show, I'd probably want to get a real rock and look at it, right? But if it's something sort of over in the corner, you can oftentimes, kind of make one up a little bit.
Well, how do you feel about, I've discussed this with a friend several times. If you have painted this, this object,
Yep.
and it's that angle that you've painted it from, how comfortable are you to then move it in space to say, I'm now going to, because I'm so used to the form and I know how light and form works. Are you comfortable moving things in space and saying the vantage point is going to be different, but it's still the same object? Are you comfortable doing that?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on the object, and how much you're talking about, changing it, right? It would depend, I mean, there again, it would depend to a certain degree on how much you're changing it, but then also how sort of highly kind of realistic do you need that part of the painting to be, right? And that's another thing that I always say about kind of photos and things like that, right, is that, everybody always has questions, right, about that, right? And particularly if they paint from photos, right, they get very like, well, what if you wanted to paint a giraffe, right? And well, then you'd have to use a photo, right? And you go, no, not really. I mean, anybody can paint a giraffe, right? Like a 5-year-old can paint a giraffe. It just depends on like how you want it to look, right? Nobody is being stopped from doing anything, right? So then it's a matter of, well, how good do you need this giraffe to look? How good do you want this giraffe to look? And how deeply do you need to understand this giraffe? And then how important to you is painting that giraffe, right? Is it worth it enough that you're going to do the research and kind of figure out how giraffes look and do some sketches and things to then, paint that giraffe? Or does that make us kind of say like, well, now maybe forget it, right? I don't know. Everybody's got their own equation ultimately, right? That again, it's not to say that I think anybody's, particularly doing anything right or wrong. I think everybody should, approach things in the way that they find interesting. But to me, very much, I sort of lose interest a little bit when it comes to me painting from photos, at least.
So how expansive is your visual library? Do you have sketchbooks where you're adding different subjects there, where you think, not necessarily a giraffe, but I mean, whatever object you may encounter where you think this is a form I find interesting to interact with others? Is that something that you're constantly updating?
More and more it really is, and I wouldn't say I have some vast encyclopedic collection or anything. But I have things here and there. And I think that, again, it sort of depends on what you're, trying to paint, right? That I think there's an awful lot of things, I'm like, don't have any particular plans to paint, right? Don't have any immediate plans to paint a car or a basketball shoe or lots of things, right? A computer, right? That somebody else might want to paint. I mean, I'm sure people do, right? Well, definitely people do. But I think that for the most part, I mean, you also sort of tend to gravitate, I think, towards certain things more than others, right? That I don't know how many people are really constantly painting completely different things every time they sit down to make a painting, right? I think sometimes maybe, right? But I think for the most part, people, tend to find certain, not necessarily the same things, but certain types of things that interest them, maybe.
What are the combinations that interest you? Are there consistencies in the groupings that you find yourself gravitated towards?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm always kind of drawn towards I think the natural world. In some ways maybe more than man-made objects, although that's not entirely true. There are definitely man-made objects in my paintings. But definitely, I mean, more and more I've been really interested in painting animals. Little bit more and more painting sort of natural scenes, right? Working little bits of landscape and things into stuff. Not that I don't still totally also paint still lifes. I mean, I definitely do, which is probably for the most part, if anybody knows my work, probably what they're most familiar with. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think to me, painting natural world things has always been an interest to me. I think in some ways, things that I tend to gravitate towards less are, sort of highly mechanical drawings. So, like a I don't know, a car's engine or something, I look at and kind of go like, oh God, I don't know, not for me. Right. Now I have friends who love painting stuff like that, right? Who will get into like labels and the perspective and all those things and like work out all the technical drawing to those things and are just like loving it. And I love looking at their paintings, right? But it's not something I find myself really gravitating a ton towards, just in terms of kind of the process and, just kind of the act of doing it in some ways.
Yeah. Well, over your right shoulder, I believe it'd be, is a combination of an animal and still life, because you have a bird on
Oh
a
yeah.
branch and
Yeah.
still life there. Absolutely beautiful, and I love it. And I'm curious
Oh,
about
thanks.
that grouping as well, whether it's
Yeah.
the shape design as well as the light, or if it's a kind of combination of textures, or what is it that kind of makes you interested in this combination of kind of subjects together? What's their relation, I suppose, for you?
Yeah. I think it depends. I mean, on the painting in some ways. I mean, I think this this one back here. Uh, for the most part, I was playing around with I think both, light effect and in that case, sort of a new palette of colors. I mean, just tubes of paint. That one was sort of an experiment that I was limiting down my palette a little bit and seeing, okay, like what can I squeeze color wise out of, a slightly smaller grouping of pigments. So that was a lot of actually what was going on in that one. But yeah, I mean, I think definitely to me, I mean, I'm always drawn towards sort of light effects, right? How that can create either atmosphere or, sort of mood, emotion, right? I think there's an awful lot that just the light itself can do, actually, even almost kind of regardless of the objects chosen in a way. Not that there's not objects I'm more and less interested in, but very oftentimes getting that light effect to really do something is oftentimes kind of the initial, spark of the idea of the painting.
Yeah. A friend of mine, when I showed her the artist who I'm interested in for the podcast, when I showed her yours, it really excited her because she's from the Peter Paul Rubens school of painting, and that's what
Oh,
she learns. And so with the other
great.
artists, because I find all kinds of artists that I'm looking at,
Yeah.
and they'll just be really thick and abstract or expressionistic, and there's such a broad spectrum that we find
Sure.
interesting. But yours is so well rendered and it's so finely done. Is that something which from your illustration was a, a kind of adjustment, or did you illustrate? Because I saw that you drew incredibly similar in a very finely rendered style. So was there any adjustment from your illustration days, or was that a fairly natural transition for you?
I mean, there wasn't much of an adjustment in that sense. In that when I was doing illustration, I was mostly doing nature illustration. So I was drawing, birds and plants and things like that. And so, I mean, it was still fairly, refined, fairly, hopefully believable. I mean, as a painter, I mean, I've definitely improved a lot since my illustration days. But in a way, I mean, the illustrations that I was doing at least weren't necessarily such a far distance away from the paintings that I make.
That's interesting. I mean, the first piece of yours that I saw, I'm going to quickly revisit it now so that I can tell you the specific name. So forgive me whilst I scroll for a moment because I want to.
Sure.
There it is. It is Portrait of an Egret.
Oh yeah.
Amazing. And I love how there's information that's missing there, but it's not necessary because you've let the detail come through with the light, and then the midtone will kind of flatten out, but only to kind of heighten the form in other areas. I find that incredibly interesting. I've never attempted that myself, and it's just a beautiful way of painting. Is that something which you learned in the atelier?
Um, yeah, I mean, definitely parts of it, right? For sure. And I mean, I think definitely, I mean, the way that I paint now, I mean, for the most part and for, a while, is all pretty rooted in what I studied at the Grand Central Atelier. And I had studied, I mean, kind of a handful of places before that. I mean, it was like in a sort of art high school, and then I did an illustration degree, and then I was in atelier back in California, and then eventually at GCA. But I would say process wise and, sort of thinking wise, an awful lot of it is based in, kind of what I studied at the Grand Central Atelier. And no, I mean, from that, everybody takes that and kind of, tweaks it in their own ways. And, definitely there's a lot of things that I've kind of, learned on my own since I was a student there too. But yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that it's rooted in that for sure,
The same friend of mine who I discussed your work with, she often and I mentioned this on the podcast several times, so for repeat viewers and listeners, forgive me, but I'll repeat quickly what she's told me several times, which is if you have 10 minutes to do a life drawing, spend 5 minutes observing the model, because then the remaining 5 minutes will be far better informed than if you were to look for 30 seconds and then start drawing. And I really value that type of different approach of kind of challenging yourself to look and see the relationships and the values for longer, and understanding your subject for longer than what is natural to someone who's drawing or painting. Is there anything like that which you have for your own work, where you've kind of almost got, whether it's rules or whether it's principles or just an understanding that you have about observing a subject or creating a piece of work that you could share?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a lot of them in a way, but one thing that I always come back to, and I think that this winds up applying in a lot of different ways. One real, for me, kind of turning point in my own, progression as a painter, was really the idea that the better you can understand something, I think the better you can depict it. And I think that a lot of times we sort of get like maybe not quite that message in art school. And what I mean by that is I think that a lot of times we're, in my experience at least, a lot of classes sort of almost attempt to train you to be kind of almost like a thoughtless seeing machine, right? That they try to, almost in a way sort of take the thinking part out and say like, just stare at the thing and stare at the thing, right? And no, definitely. I mean, I think you do have to stare at the thing, right? No doubt. But I think for me, I mean, really, and this was one thing that really came about when I first came to study at GCA is, and it sounds really silly, but just the idea that like things look ways for reasons, right? That if something is happening up there, there's some reason why it looks that way, and so like not some other way, right? And I think so much of my training prior to that had been essentially, you'd have a teacher come around and you'd be painting and they'd just say like, well, it needs to get redder there. And you'd go like, oh yeah, okay, right. And you'd sort of had this idea in the back of your head that like, if I just spend X number of years staring really hard, eventually my eyes will like be as good as theirs, I guess, and And I think half the time it wasn't even that they were necessarily like, particularly any better than the students in some cases. I think it was just that it wasn't their painting. And so it's pretty easy to come around to somebody else's thing and spot something that's wrong, just because it's not yours. But, I think at GCA, I mean, people really started explaining things in terms of like, oh, this is happening and this is happening, and those two things are the reason that this is getting darker here, right? Or whatever, right? And all of a sudden it was like, oh, yeah, right. No, there's like things up there to actually understand. There's like principles at work that are, fairly repetitive and predictable in a lot of ways, right? That you can actually kind of like come to understand and like get a grasp of, how things actually work. Which, if you read old, sort of painting manuals and stuff from, the 17th century and stuff like that, very much, I mean, all those artists who were writing about it were very much thinking of painting as a way of coming to understand the world around them, right? And I think that component of it, I think maybe has, sort of diminished in a lot of like art education at this particular moment in history, right? That I think kind of gets left out. And, I always say the classic, sort of example of that, my students will, if any of them are listening to this will sound familiar, right? The classic sort of example I think is, I used to get taught in college, you'd always hear teachers say things like, draw what you see and not what you know, right? Which sounds like sort of this piece of great advice in a way. And in a way, I mean, I think there's a certain utilitarian quality to a piece of advice like that, particularly at first, because we're not very used to actually just like looking at things for a period of time, right? Like your friend mentioned. But to me, I think in one way, I think, I mean, it's maybe debatable whether that's even possible to kind of draw what you see. But I think to me, always we're using some combination of what we see and what we know when we're making a drawing. And to me, the goal wouldn't be so much to like, cut out knowledge. And, that's where I say, we're sometimes sort of encouraged, I think, to be a little bit of like almost sort of a mindless seeing machine, right? To me, I think that's not so much the goal. It's not to kind of exclude what we know. It's just to know the best possible stuff we can know, right? Like know better stuff, right? And then when you're combining that with, sort of this deep, intense, observation of what's in front of you, I think the two of those things pair up to give us such better results than either one would be able to give us, solely on its own.
So it's almost undoing the bad assumptions that we can make of poorly observed aspects of a subject. I've always found that, well, in fact, a guest who I did interview, it may be the episode that you watched, but Paul Heaston said that his eye can communicate with his hand perfectly, but his brain intercepts the observation, makes an assumption, and then it will elongate foreshortening and it will lighten the shadow. And so he said
Right.
that if you can undo his brain's assumption that's incorrect, he will half the foreshortening because his brain has doubled it. It's not an exact rule, but it's somewhere around there. And the same with the shadow. He said it's half as dark as it should be, so he darkens it far more. So I assume it's things like that where that's things that we're trying to learn better so that the knowledge is stronger to reinforce the vision.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, and I would say in a case like that, right? Yeah, definitely. I mean, our brain can 100% get in our way, right? But it can also be kind of the way around falling into that trap too, right? And so, that's why, we learn about things like foreshortening and stuff, and then, we start to kind of deal with those things a little bit better. And, one example I use a lot is that, I forget when it was maybe high school or college or something, but an art teacher had us all do a sort of an assignment or an experiment or whatever you want to call it, and they just asked us to draw a bicycle from our memory, and it's like it's a funny thing, right? Because we all pretty much see bicycles every day, like we know what they look like, we can identify one, but when you actually sit down to try and draw one, you're like, damn, I don't know what a bike looks like at all, right? And, so we have all these just like ridiculous, it's like a room full of artists, right? And we all have these like ridiculous drawings of bikes that look like they were done by, 5-year-olds or something, right? But, the reason that I always use that example is that a really good friend of mine, who's not an artist, at all, he is a cyclist, right? He's like a distance cyclist. He goes on all these crazy long rides and he fixes his own bikes and, does all this stuff. I always say if you put him and I in a room together and told us both to draw a bike out of our heads, right? 100% his is going to be better than mine, right? Because he knows the parts of a bike, right? He knows what bikes are all about and I don't, right? Now, if you put a bike in front of us, I think I'm going to make the better drawing, right? Just because I draw and he doesn't, right? But there again, right? I mean, I think part of it is definitely, to me, part of being kind of, well-rounded in a sense, as an artist is kind of working on both, right? And I wouldn't ever recommend to somebody to like solely draw out of their head and their imagination and never look at a subject or anything like that. I mean, that would be like a crazy piece of advice to give somebody, right? But I think that the opposite can be true too, right? That if we're constantly kind of cutting off the idea of like understanding the structure of something or getting to understand how X, Y, or Z works, and solely focusing on sort of like the optical impression that hits us, I think that limits us in a different way.
No, I agree. So it makes me wonder whether your work is a combination of both. Do you paint from life and then let your imagination make decisions in certain aspects of work, or do you have rules surrounding the use of that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I take liberties with things, I mean, constantly, right? And I think that anytime, I mean, there's an opportunity where I say, if I just nudge this shape over a little bit, it's just going to make a better picture, right? Ultimately, we're making pictures, right? I always kind of joke that there's no like realism police that are going to kick in the door of your studio if you change something around a little bit, right? To me, the goal isn't so much that we have to adhere to exactly what's in front of us. It's we want to be able to change things or nudge things or take liberties with things when it suits our purposes, right? We just want to be able to if we want to depict that thing exactly the way it is, well, I mean, we want to be able to do that too, right? We just don't want weird nudges and inconsistencies working in sort of by accident, right? Where we're just like, oh God, I didn't mean to do that, and now this one eye is in a weird place, right? I mean, that's a bummer, right? that gets in the way of your picture being effective ultimately.
With work like yours, it can seem to have materialized on the canvas because it looks so elegant on the surface that you can't see the work underneath there. So I'm wondering, is there a grid system you start with? Is there a ground as your go-to? What does your work start like?
It depends. It really varies a lot from painting to painting, depending on what it is. I don't ever particularly use a grid. I mean, I have in my life used them. I mean, I don't know, maybe a couple times, but generally speaking, I don't. And It would depend. I mean, so sometimes if I'm working out, an entire composition ahead of time before starting, I may work out a drawing, separately on paper and, kind of transfer it onto the canvas. Then, do some kind of an underpainting from there and then, start, kind of building my final layers. Um, Although there's other times when I'll just start, directly in on the canvas with a brush, just, start painting one piece and, kind of take it from there. A lot of the paintings I've been doing most recently, I'm kind of making up the composition as I go along, and so I'll just start with one piece, right, and just paint one piece of that picture, fully finished, kind of, wherever, right in the middle of the canvas, or usually not right in the middle, but somewhere, right. And say, okay, great. I've got one object there. Now that that's there, what do I want to do next? Right. And I'll think about it a little bit. And I'll say, oh, okay, I'm going to put this thing here, sort of next to it. I'll go find one of those and, set it up and paint that next to it and sort of build the composition kind of one move at a time, which is a really fun way to make a picture, actually, especially if you've got these, sort of perishable things like, fish or flowers or something that aren't going to give you a lot of time. You can sort of, build your composition on the fly, in, sort of a really sort of improvisational way, right? In that there isn't a fully formed plan when I'm starting, and I'm sort of letting it build and grow, kind of responding to what I do and kind of planning my next move from there to a degree, which has been a lot of fun. It's definitely an enjoyable way to make a picture.
It really relates to what I was going to ask you, because of how well observed your work is. It did make me wonder how much room there is for spontaneity, discovery, and experimentation. So is that where you find that room to play, is in the composition, or is there other aspects that we just don't know about where you are discovering things, there's epiphanies on the way? Does that often occur?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think there's, I mean, every painting is an experiment to me. um, yeah, there's always something that I'm playing with or tweaking or, experimenting with, and it could be, just pushing, paint quality, right, in a particular way, right. It could be, pushing color in a particular way that's, different. It could be definitely, sort of coming up with the composition on the fly. But yeah, almost every painting, I mean, even if it's completely planned out from the beginning with a full drawing of the composition transferred onto the canvas and everything, it always changes. I mean, from the start to the end of, what that's going to be. And it might change in more dramatic ways, it might change in more subtle ways, but even, just a couple sort of moments of color, next to one another might kind of change the direction that rendering takes, and it could say, oh, that's okay, something kind of neat is starting to happen in there a little bit. I'm going to maybe push that a little bit in some of these, other areas that are coming up. And it can, even with the same kind of arrangement of objects, the vibe of that picture might change, pretty dramatically throughout the course of executing it. Definitely.
I suppose with the piece that we discussed over your shoulder as well, how you were experimenting with your color palette, it made me wonder, do you have a set color palette? And if so, could you take us through what those colors are?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I always say about my color palette is I think of it as sort of a slowly evolving thing that at any given point I usually have like a kind of a go-to palette, but it definitely changes from year to year. And so, my go-to palette a few years back was very different than my go-to palette right now. I have no doubt that it'll probably be different a couple of years from now too, right? At the moment, one of the things that has interested me is, I don't know, a year or so ago, maybe I went on kind of a deep dive on historical palettes, and what different artists were using at different times, different regions, and things like that. As best I could find. And got really interested in it. One of the things I've always kind of said as a teacher, of art and painting is, that I think it doesn't really matter that much what your palette of colors is. I think that I always encourage the idea that we're just thinking in terms of navigating the three axes of hue, value, and chroma whenever we're mixing color, and whatever ingredients you use to do that are fairly flexible. That being said, I started getting interested in, this idea of, what did some of the painters that I like, really have access to, right? And in a similar kind of way, right? I mean, into the photos thing is, I think that a lot of times the limitations of something sort of dictate what the art form becomes in a way, right? That just in the same way, that what ingredients you have access to in a particular region, inherently influences the cuisine that develops in that location, right? And I always use the example of Hawaii, right? And they have all this spam and everything, right? And you're like, why? Right? But then you look back and you're like, oh, okay, that was kind of the meat they were getting historically, that they had access to, and the cuisine kind of built up around it. And now they can probably get other meats, but it's kind of in part of the cuisine now, right? Like it's part of the whole thing, right? And I think that oftentimes, I say that about photography, right? That I think, these painters that we look back to and, really admire and everything, a lot of what they did developed as a way to make pictures, right? I mean, that it was the way to make a picture happen, right? That they didn't have this alternative of, sort of using a camera, and they sort of had to figure things out. And that evolved into kind of the styles that, we all recognize as, historical, sort of oil painting. So I always think that there's an interesting, relationship in those limitations that people have, and between those and what they actually wind up creating. So looking at some of the, sort of more historical palettes that, people were using in, the 17th and 18th century primarily, I started kind of going down a rabbit hole of, pigments and playing around with them and seeing, okay, well, what happens if I do limit this down in kind of a similar way to, what these guys had. And so at the moment, my kind of go-tos on my palette, I mean, I've got lead white, I've got a Naples yellow, which is made by Michael Harding, so it's a genuine lead-based Naples yellow. I've got a yellow ochre. I've got a raw sienna, a raw umber. I've got a red ochre, a burnt umber, and an ivory black. And an awful lot of the time, that's kind of what's on my palette. I do have some other ones that I'll kind of whip out from time to time if I need it for something. So I've got a vermilion if I need a slightly more chromatic red. I've got a Prussian blue, if I'm painting something blue. I've got a few various earth greens that I might use, like an alizarin. Handful of other things that I might take out it from time to time if I'm painting something of a particular color, right? But for the most part, I don't, and there's no reason for this, but I don't seem to find myself painting that many blue objects. And, so I think about it, I'm like, well, God, I don't know what things are blue. I don't know. I mean, there's blue things in the world for sure, right? But it seems for whatever reason, I don't find myself painting a lot of them. And so, I'll put out a blue if I'm painting something blue. But other than that, I don't necessarily reach for it all that much, So, those are some of my kind of go-tos at the moment. Like I said, I mean, I have no doubt that that'll evolve and change, and, over time, as it has, up until this point, pretty consistently. But that's kind of my go-tos at the moment.
No, that's really interesting. I like the idea of going down a rabbit hole of other color palettes from throughout history. There's I'm in North Wales, so
Yeah.
I planned this trip with this old farmer who's in his 80s. I'd Googled it, Paris Mountain, but Paris spelled with a Y, Paris Mountain
Oh.
in North Wales, and it just looked like something from Willy Wonka. It just looked like it was so colourful. I just got blue,
Yeah.
yellow, and red.
Yeah.
I wonder, have you ventured into egg tempera? And if so, how did you find your experience with that medium?
I haven't ever done egg tempera. And I think at some point, in like sort of high school and college, I mean, I played around with a lot of different, mediums and stuff, but somehow that one never quite made it in the rotation. I think no one was teaching it, or, something like that, probably. But no, for pretty long time now, I've been pretty focused on oil. But definitely people sourcing their own pigments. I mean, that's like a whole world unto itself. It really, really fascinating. And there's, a bunch of people that, as I was going down that rabbit hole, I started following on, Instagram and stuff, who go to various locations and, source their own pigments and make their own, watercolors and, all sorts of stuff, out of them. It's a really, really fascinating world, all those, natural, earthy pigments.
Yeah. Well, out of your research then, who is an artist who's an artist whose palette you found interesting? Is there anyone who you can remember where you think, I really liked, Constable, or I really liked, Rembrandt, or whoever it is that you looked into?
Yeah. A lot of them, I mean, one of the kind of interesting things about it has been, and it's always with those things, it's always a matter of like, who can you find information on, right? And I mean, that can take various forms, right? I mean, there can be something left in writing, from the time. There can be, chemical analyses done of their paintings, in modern times, to sort of do the detective work, So you're always kind of piecing things together in a certain way, right? So there's always a certain amount of like kind of fuzziness and guesswork involved in those things. But for the most part, it's going to be the biggest name artists are going to be the ones who have had the most research done into their process, right? So you're going to find, a lot more as far as, like Rembrandt or, Rubens or Chardin or somebody like that than you are, like Paul de Vos or Melchior Hondecoeter, right? Even though, I'd be fascinated to know what those guys are using, right? But, one of the things that I always find kind of interesting about it is that the palettes didn't vary as much back then because there just wasn't as many options for the most part, right? I mean, and that's one of the things that, can be like infuriating when you're a sort of art student looking for information, right? You find these old sources of, books from, the 17th century, and you're like, oh, now I'm going to get the good stuff, right? What paints was Rembrandt using, right? And it's all this, you read the book and it's like, well, if you're drawing Jupiter, you should give him a hat with wings. And and you're like, what? I thought you were going to tell me how to paint, right? But, one thing that's really funny about it, I mean, that always really struck me was like they never quite give you that information, right? They never say like, oh, you've put this and this and this on your palette,
Mm.
and at first it felt like, why is nobody writing this down? What doesn't this seem like a crucial piece of information, right? And then eventually, I mean, in really thinking about it, it sort of occurred to me, and it's one of those things like it occurred to me like a lot later than it really should have probably that, I'm like, well, they just didn't have the problem that we have now, right? Like they didn't go to an art store and see 300 tubes of paint and be like, which ones should I use? Right? They had like, maybe 10 options and they were like, yeah, use them. Right? Use the pigments. Right? So, but those were, I mean, definitely a few people who I, looked into to a certain degree, and then was, definitely one was Rembrandt. And he's an interesting guy. I mean, he's one of my favorites. I mean, of them all. He was always experimenting with stuff. I mean, like his process changed around all the time. His materials changed around all the time. I mean, he was just somebody who was always kind of tinkering, I think.
Mm.
And so you'll see, very little in the way of like a super fixed, anything when it comes to him, really, right? Chardin was one that there's maybe a little bit more information about. He was a little bit later too. And his palette, from what I can tell, is pretty similar to a lot of people of that era, and is not too far off from kind of the palette that I was describing earlier, that I'm kind of more or less using at the moment.
Yeah.
He's an interesting one too, because we have actually several paintings that he left behind of artists' materials, and so we've got several paintings he did of palettes loaded with paint, right? So you can kind of get a sense. Now, there's always still a little bit of guesswork as well involved in that, but we can get a pretty decent sense, of what he was using.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And it's a bit of a backpedal for what I should have asked you a while ago, and it dawned on me that I haven't asked this question. Is your partner, do they paint similar to your style?
Fairly similarly. I mean, I think we're, I don't think most people would mistake our paintings for each other's, but definitely within a similar vein,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always interesting when there's a couple who paint in the same house, because then you surely, I mean, do you welcome conversations about, stages of painting, or do you pretty much comfortable in your own space, or do you kind of think I'll sometimes walk in, or she'll sometimes walk in and say, that's too warm, or something like that, and say, do you have that trust with each other?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we chime in on each other's paintings
Yeah.
constantly, and yeah, oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, if I'm, kind of going back and forth on something, I'll definitely ask her opinion. And, definitely if she's, working on something and, having uncertainties, like she'll kind of call me over to look at it. And yeah, no, it's a really, really, really great thing, actually. I really enjoy it, and I think we both also, understand each other's taste and each other's goals, enough that we can kind of be, helpful to one another. I mean, we definitely have a lot of the same influences. When we first met, we kind of bonded over the fact that we both were really into Melchior Dondecoder. And we were like, you know him? Nobody knows him. You're like the first person I've ever met that's heard of this guy. He's like the greatest painter ever. And we were in Amsterdam a year ago, and we found the church where he was buried, and we visited his grave and everything, and it's right. So yeah, I mean, we get a lot excited about a lot of the same work, which is good because I think it's always, I mean, if somebody's on too much of a different sort of wavelength to you, like the advice can sometimes just be like, not so helpful. Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, we definitely have a good, I think, kind of understanding of each other's, what we're trying to do, and that we can be pretty helpful, to one another.
That's fantastic. Yeah,
Uh,
that's really good. I just wanted to ask because it's always a curiosity, and it just sounds like such a lovely situation to have someone who knows you and who you can trust to have that conversation. So yeah, that's wonderful. But yeah, we are kind of at the last part of the podcast now. So I need to ask, what's your relationship been like with galleries? Have you had a good experience with exhibitions and things like that?
uh, it's like anything, I mean, it's been hit or miss. I've, worked with a lot of different galleries over the years, and some have been great. Some have been less great. you know, I don't know that I've ever had any terrible experiences with a gallery, but there's been some who just didn't really sell anything. you know, um, but yeah, I mean, I think like anything, it's hit and miss. I mean, I definitely I do work with galleries, and sell some things through there. I also sell things on my own, to people directly, and I don't have any exclusive partnership with any particular gallery or anything. So sometimes they sell things, sometimes I sell them myself. It's a little of this, little of that, but hit and miss. Like anything.
That's good to know. I mean, we do welcome whatever feedback because I work with a gallery. I don't put work in
Yeah,
there, but I work with a gallery where, for example, today I was visiting an artist with the gallerist to go and
yeah,
select the work for a show for the Christmas show for the end of the year. So it's a privilege for me to be able to see the artist space and to
mm,
see the gallerist process for the
yeah,
curation and selection of the work. And it's a fantastic gallery. Now, I've
that's
heard horror stories, not through that gallery, but through
yeah,
other artists, of galleries with exclusivity deals where they will not allow the artist to exhibit anywhere else, even if
yeah,
it's outside of the area. And then they will
yeah,
hold that work for ransom as if it's their own property. And
yeah,
when they sell the work, not necessarily pay the artist. This isn't
yeah,
one gallery. This is several stories of
yeah.
several galleries.
Oh yeah,
Now, it's not every gallery. It's not even most galleries, but there's enough stories of that where we like to discuss where things go wrong. But obviously, we don't want it to seem as though galleries are a bad thing. They're an
yeah,
interesting dynamic with the artist, and we like to explore that power dynamic and that balance of relying on someone to sell your work on your behalf and to give you a space that is reasonable for your work to be placed amongst others, because I think
yeah.
that's quite important. So that's why we ask these things, in case there's anything which you've experienced about that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I have definitely heard those stories from people as well. I haven't personally had any, real like gallery horror stories or anything.
That's good.
I mean, the worst that I can say is, I've given work to them and they didn't sell it. Um, which happens. But yeah, I mean, I know people who are all in with galleries. I mean, who have great relationships, where they're just like, nope, this is my gallery, go there to buy my stuff, and aren't doing anything elsewhere. I know people who are like, I'm done with galleries, I'm only selling work directly myself, never again. And then most people I know are somewhere kind of in the middle, like I am. I mean, they do some work with some galleries. They'll be in particular shows here and there, and then will also sell stuff, on their own. Is most of the people I know seem to be doing.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, I'm relieved. It's always nice to hear when someone hasn't had such negative experiences. So if people are local or visiting any areas where you exhibit, where can they see your work in person? Are there galleries where you can name that you exhibit your work?
Yeah, so if they're in the areas, I have some paintings in William Reese Gallery in Jamesport, Long Island. I have some things at Sheldon Fine Art in Newport, Rhode Island. If you're here in August for the Five and Under show, I usually have work in Arcadia Gallery here in New York City. And then if somebody's interested, they can always ask to see something at my studio. I do definitely, also, show and sell things myself. So, people can get in touch with me. They can go to my website too, of course,
Fantastic. Well, that was the next thing I was going to ask is what social media should people go to purchase your work and to support you? Where would you like them to go?
Yeah, I mean, so, my website is just my name, devincecil-wishing.com, dash between Cecil and Wishing. Anybody can email me, directly through there if they're interested. They can also get in touch with me through Instagram, very easy. I am also on Facebook. They can get in touch with me there. Any of the above,
Fantastic.
all work. Yeah.
Well, the links for the galleries and for your social media will be in the description of this video and on any audio platforms where you found this podcast. We do encourage everyone to look at the links, explore them, support the artist. Your work's absolutely amazing. I really love it. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
Having you as a guest. It's such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode. If you can support the podcast by leaving a like or a comment down below, that would really be great. But what we'd really like is if you're able to leave a review on the podcast channels, wherever you listen to it or download it, because that helps us get spread around the internet so that more people have access to us and able to see what we're making.
Also, follow us on Instagram, and we'd really appreciate it if you like and engage with our posts. Help get the podcast better known. Thanks for listening.